Unfortunately, in agriculture, Australian businesses barely rate on the global scale. This chart shows our leading Australian agribusinesses on the left-hand side and some of the leading international players on the right, ranked in terms of net assets. Looks a bit like putting a Shetland pony up against black caviar, doesn't it? Well, for good measure, we're also chucking some lead in this particular Shetland saddlebag in the shape of restrictions on our ports. Ports are the link between us and the regions of growing demand. Ironically, they're also the most regulated point of our supply chain. Regulation of port access was implemented as a transitional arrangement when the single wheat desk was removed in 2008. Under this regime, bulk handlers like GrainCorp must have an access undertaking approved by the ACCC that governs the way third parties access our port infrastructure. The regime requires extensive compliance, consultation and the continuous disclosure of information such as shipping stem and elevation capacity at each port. We don't object at all to the fact these transitional arrangements were applied. In the immediate aftermath of the removal of the single wheat desk, such arrangements were very useful as a part of a staged transition to full deregulation. However, 3 years down the track and with over 20 accredited exporters successfully shipping from Australia, the transition's over and the training wheels are no longer necessary. The largest grain exporters are those same multinational companies I just showed you, more than 20 times larger than GrainCorp. Companies of this size and sophistication don't need special regulatory protection. They could eat us up for morning tea with room left for lunch. They've got plenty of capital to acquire or build their own assets, which they've been doing. Ultimately, what companies of this size and sophistication do need is a flexible, low-cost supply chain that meets their particular requirements, underpinned with long-term commercial security. And that's exactly what we would like to offer them. We have every commercial incentive to offer them, but we can't offer them under the current restrictive regime. No other Australian commodity is restricted in the way grain is, not iron ore, coal or wood chips. And similarly, Australian ports are the only grain terminals worldwide that operate under these constraints. We therefore wholeheartedly support the Australian Government's announcement last year that it will recommend the Productivity Commission recommendations in its report of the earlier year proceed into legislation. Essentially, those recommendations would take us from a very restrictive, inflexible legislative environment to a voluntary code of practice. And that will allow, or should allow, greater nimbleness while still providing the usual safeguards of competition law. The government recognises that there's no ongoing need for port regulation on competition grounds and that the existing terms of the Competition and Consumer Act do provide adequate protection. It also recognises that there are very important economic incentives, very real economic incentives for providers such as GrainCorp to provide open access to multiple exporters. Already we have the situation where about a third of export grain is bypassing the regulated bulk ports and leaving Eastern Australia by unhindered alternative routes such as containers. This chart shows the economic incentive that we have as a company by summarising the fact that in a good year, excess port capacity, and you can see there FY11 was a very good year, we still only used about half the 15 million tonnes of capacity we have at our ports. Across the board, the average utilisation of Australian grain port terminals is less than 1/4 that of competing international grain ports, which turn over their capacity many, many more times each year. The reality is that this relative underuse of capacity guarantees non-discriminatory commercial behaviour by GrainCorp and other port terminal owners in Australia, because we must seek to get the best utilisation out of our assets. Why on earth would we want to do anything other than attract as much grain as we can, no matter who owns it, to our valuable port terminals? Why on earth would we risk the creation of competing supply chain assets to our own already underutilised assets. Let me describe the lead in the saddlebag that ongoing ports regulation does impose on us and on our exporter customers. The regulation is based on a one-size-fits-all approach that requires all customers to be treated in the same way, even though they all have different requirements. It hinders our national export competitiveness by reducing the flexibility and innovation of Australian port operators. Increasingly, it will act as a disincentive to invest in new capacity. Port regulation prevents us from flexibly operating and pricing our port terminals to respond to changing demand and the variable and complex requirements in handling over 100 different grades of grain from our 280 country silos. The recent floods, which we talked about before, actually provide a good example of what I mean by the lack of flexibility. So this is what we were dealing with up in northern New South Wales earlier in the year, which substantially affected downstream the operations of our Newcastle port because trains, unsurprisingly, were not able to operate on tracks that look like that. Because we had a full program at Newcastle, so ships booked up to use the capacity at Newcastle and no grain able to come through to port, we took a commercial decision to assist our exporter customers by adding alternative capacity to our other ports. But to do that, we had to circumvent the usual 6-month consultation process which is required by our access undertaking. We took the decision to do that. We took a legal risk because we judged it was in the industry's best interests so to do. And the ACCC were cooperative in the process, but they made it very clear that they couldn't sanction our decision to do this or give us immunity from prosecution. To give you another example, the current regime means that we're not able to offer longer-term arrangements to those of our exporter customers who want to back Australian grain. We had one customer approach us to open our shipping stem a year ahead to help them plan ahead for next year's crop, but we couldn't respond to that because we have to get agreement from all of our customers to be able to make such a decision. Inevitably, there's resistance from some quarters to the government's proposed changes to remove this kind of costly regulation. In fact, there are actually calls for further restrictions on bulk exporters and even a ludicrous push to force bulk handlers to provide full disclosure of the stocks held in our network. Maybe I can understand this if we were a public utility, which we're not. Or just maybe if the proposal related to disclosure of information about grain held in all storages, not just our storages. But the proponents of these kind of arguments don't seem to trouble themselves too much with logic. They're only too happy to load the old pony up with more lead, forgetting this is a global race now and Australia's short on thoroughbreds. An unencumbered supply chain is an efficient, flexible supply chain that enables GrainCorp and others to invest and operate from Australia with confidence, that allows Australian exporters to serve the end consumers of Australian wheat as well as we possibly can, and which ultimately delivers Australian growers the most competitive product. GrainCorp understands that deregulation can be difficult. However, we'll be working constructively with industry participants in the hope that we can agree an appropriately light-touched voluntary code for port access. If we can get this right, I really believe that that winning scenario I outlined is Australia's destiny. And I look forward to celebrating what will be my 90th birthday at that 2052 ABARES conference in 40 years' time. Thank you very much.